Thank you, Russet. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Deirdre. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ivan, all the way from Tokyo. This is really special. I just want to say, I know Ivan and I have talked about this already, but the publication, which is the occasion for us coming together, Japanese photography magazines, is not just a really beautifully designed book. It also is just a tremendous resource that was really missing from especially sort of English language publications in and around this field, the history of Japanese photography. And I keep thinking about what a difference it would have made if something like this had existed when I was an undergrad or even a graduate student. It would have really, actually, not to be dramatic, it would have changed my life. So it's amazing that it's out in the world now. I think it's going to be just truly remarkable resource for new scholars of Japanese photography and also just people who enjoy looking at and thinking about this particular field and history. So thank you. And I know there's somebody sort of in this room without whom this project would not exist, which is of course Kaneko Ryuichi. And I know you wanted to acknowledge him right at the top of our talk too.
Yes.
The main author is Kaneko Ryuichi. He was a true champion of Japanese photography. He and a handful of scholars helped bring Japanese photography to a broad audience through their research, making their own collections accessible, supporting scholarship, as well as the work of museums both inside and outside Japan. I am the beneficiary, greedily so, of that very generous spirit, and the materials I brought from Tokyo are from his personal collection. The reason why I handed out chocolate is because it was part of how we worked together. I would go to his library once a week for a long time. My job, though it was never spoken, was to supervise the chocolate. So each time on my way to our sessions, I would get a box of chocolate and it needed to be milk chocolate, never dark chocolate. I made that mistake once and was asked to take home the dark chocolate. He would call the chocolate his fuel. I would insert the fuel into the teacher and he would start speaking with such passion and precision for hours on end. He would jump out of his seat, dash over to one of the many shelves, and pull out a magazine to discuss some specific feature. He knew off the top of his head the year and the month of publication of all the features. So finding the right magazine from the shelf took a matter of seconds. The reason why he could recall all that information is because he grew up with Japanese photography through magazines. His father was also a photo hobbyist, and so magazines were something that were always around. For him, it wasn't a data set. It was like, oh yeah, that year this happened, and on that month, this was that feature. It was all hardwired into his personal memory. So, in that sense, this book brings to a conclusion a 50-year journey.
So it makes sense in sort of why Kaneko Sensei would be interested in publishing this kind of project, because for him it was integral to his whole lifelong interest and passion for the field. But for you, just before we sort of get into the case studies for this evening, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about the rationale behind publishing a book like this, what some of the challenges were, because I'm sure there were many, and what you feel like it really contributes in terms of why photo magazines, particularly in Japan. What is the story that this book is trying to tell about the role of this format?
Okay. This book's story begins 20 years ago with another book I made with Kaneko sensei called Japanese Photobooks of the 1960s and 70s. In making that book, I came to realize that digging into photography magazines was essential for understanding how all those masterpiece photo books came to be, and that Japan's magazine culture was not only a medium for photography, but it was also its subject. Today, a lot of photography has been absorbed into the discourse of art. On the other hand, up until recently, photography in Japan was very much about media, namely mass media. So, this book on magazines is my attempt to reset the categories and to discuss Japanese photography on its own terms. To really sell that point, all of the illustrations in the book, without exception, are reproductions of magazine spreads. In other words, the book is a history of Japanese photography told exclusively through its magazines. For a bit of context for our talk today, I'll also mention that, particularly in post war Japan, the camera manufacturing industry was extremely important for the country's recovery after the war. Also, we have to keep in mind that there was a massive hobbyist market for cameras who were producing photographs, and the magazines were servicing that very large market.
When we first started thinking about doing this salon together, one of the ways that we thought about, because there's just so many different magazines, there's different publishers, different formats, different genres in some ways of magazines, which we'll certainly kind of cover today. But one of the challenges even we faced when we were thinking about this event was, well, how do we even think about covering or talking about this subject? And so we decided to sort of approach it via 4 little case studies. One of the first, well, no, that's not, it was the first one, but one of the ones that we landed on was Hamaya Hiroshi, who some of you might be aware of already. Ivan has very generously brought some from Kaneko's collection. Examples of Hamaya's work in the pre-war period. We'll flip through sort of as we're talking, because we thought that Hamaya would offer an interesting view into sort of the early 20th century version of the photo magazine, and also a photographer who sort of bridges World War II and the way in which the photo magazine is linked up with all of these other questions about nationality, about memory, imperialism, war, and how the artist fits into all of those questions. So, should we flip?
Yes. Hamaya Hiroshi was a very important photographer in pre-war Japan and also post-war Japan. He was, for a period of over 10 years, he photographed rituals and rites that were carried out in a mountain village. For example, here we see what happened in January each year on the summer solstice. The text that accompanies his photographs are by an ethnographer. These images function as documents while also exhibiting expressive aspects. Why these very local and dated practices became of such interest was because they were a glimpse into the ancient character of Japanese culture. And in the post war period, these images found resonance with many because it was part of the hard reset that the country went through when attempting to grapple for a sense of identity in the new world. After many years of militarism, propaganda, and media suppression, there were many big question marks about what it meant to be Japanese. And Hamaya's work here provided one way of addressing those large questions.
And so the date on this magazine, on these publications, this series that Hamaya did is what?
These magazines are from the early 1940s. The cover of this magazine, you'll see a military person, and in the background is a flag of Imperial Japan. Even during the war, these images were published and used as part of the propaganda machine. As a book, the images were assembled and published in 1956, about 10 years after the war. Many magazines were restarted after the war in 1949, but it would still take several more years until there were more liberties of expression and print.
At the distant front, which is the most spectacular bit of photography and art design and collaboration. It's extremely graphic and very rich, but it is pure
Propaganda.
Some of the photographers that were involved in those very good photographers, were also active in these propaganda publications, which gets to be a lot of like this open tribunal of photographers, how it's has for their culpability in the war. images. So,
And Hamaya was one of them as well, right?
Hamaya.
A lot of his photographs ended up in front, and Nippon too, right? Yeah.
That's right, totally. So in the post-war period, there was a great anxiousness to distance themselves from propaganda images and that context. And that brought in a period of strong realism in Japan. The leader of that being Domon Ken, whose motto, absolutely unstaged, absolute snapshot, was a slogan of the times. Domon impressed that idea upon amateur photographers and all photographers in Japan at the time. And that was done through magazine publications, namely magazine contests. Even after the grand reset after the war, magazines became the way of establishing what was considered good photography, and that was rolled out through the contests in these magazines.
Yeah, and this brings up a really important point too, which is another interesting way to sort of think about the relationship and evolution between the magazine format and the photo book. But certainly around this time period, I think some of you may have already noticed the amount of text in relationship to the images. I mean, Hamaya also, I think, is particularly representative of this sort of what we call like kumishashin or gumishashin, like a kind of group photo, like a photo essay. So the images themselves are sort of grouped together in a way that tells a narrative. And even in this one where you get this sort of like almost time lapse. But the text is also super important, right? These images are not, especially in the magazines, are not existing in a vacuum. And especially with someone like Domon, the text is often extremely didactic in the sense of here is why these photos are being shown to you. Not only like, here's what this photographer used to shoot it so that it's instructive, but it's also paired with ideas and theories about what like realism photography means, right, alongside these photographs. So it's this sort of complete instructional package on what post-war photography should look like.
wow. So like,
Yeah.
so
Let us switch over.
John, little just to expand upon that idea Maggie brought up, we're going to go to, this is 1970, the cover story is by a photographer called Leslie Krebs, who I think at the time was very young. You'll see this portfolio in the beginning that shows the photography in a very unobstructed portfolio way. And then immediately after begins the discourse about what we just saw. This is a roundtable discussion by arbiter, art critic, art director, and one of them is the famous Masahisa. So these photographers are literally discussing how to talk about Leslie Krebs. All these pages are a way in which these photographers and editors and art directors and critics are establishing a way of looking at photography. And this is what people would have read to digest the images. As you can see, the volume of text is quite a bit. This is the guy who photographed David Bowie. So you'll see, just to give you a sense of what a Japanese camera magazine looks like, you have those editorial text, you have, of course, color advertisements on art paper, then you have other features in color. Sometimes the editors will put together a project like this for girl photographers, other pages by other featured by the photographers, and you see this has the number 8, and that means that is the 8th in the series. This is August issue. That means that this photographer was every month given a certain number of pages, like a column. And also Alan Porter, the legendary editor of Swiss Camera, he chose one photograph and wrote about it. And in this case, he wrote about Robert Frank. And that is how readers in Japan found out about what was happening, photography trends outside of Japan. This is a feature by Tomosu Shomei that is after a protest. As we get deeper into the magazine, this is where you'll really see that it's a camera magazine, because this is the history of development of Japanese cameras. And this is really the meat of the magazine. And you see it's all these pages about the camera, about the lenses. Here's a fun one. This is showing a lens that will give you a special effect. And this is, if you're going to participate in the 1970 World Expo photo contest, and this is something that you need to have. So it was very much tied in with current events, trying to sell the latest camera gear to amateur snappers. This is the Expo 70 photo contest. One of the real reasons that these camera magazines sold and had such a large circulation was the monthly contest. So there's a Kamarichi monthly photo contest. Well, any photographer that themselves an amateur photographer would regularly submit their photography to the editors of the magazine to get in print. This was why amateur photographers were really buying these magazines, apart from the specs on the camera, but was to see their own photography in print as amateur. The monthly photo contest was extremely important to keep the circulation.
I might pop over to the PowerPoint for a second because this brings up a really interesting thing that I did want to share. I want to see if this works. Hold on. Here we go. Okay. So we mentioned Domon Ken earlier. Undeniable sort of career maker and also grandfather of what photography meant and looked like, quote unquote, supposed to look like in the post-war period in Japan. We're talking sort of 50s, 60s, especially 40s, 50s, 60s. So this is on the right-hand side here. Sorry, my reproductions are not as good as Ivan's, but this is from Photowar magazine from 1958. It shows a photograph of Domon Ken doing the monthly photo selections for photo art. He's in the like Nihonma, the like Japanese realm. And you can see in front of him there, does this pointer work? No. But you can see in front of him there, all the photos laid out in front. This is sort of part of the selection process that would go on. And Domon had his hands in literally almost every magazine, right? Certainly Camera before it folded in 56, and then Photo Art, definitely. And moving into the sort of second case study, at least, which is Kawada Kikuji, who is the photographer of that image of Domon. In 1953, he submits photographs to Camera magazine, which are selected by Domon as part of this sort of monthly contest. And in the text here, Domon says, this young guy, Kawada, set in, 12-ish images or whatever of Tanjikawa base, which was one of these U.S. Army bases on Japanese soil, which were very prevalent in the post-war period and were very contentious political, gender, and race spaces, I guess you could say, and also popular subjects for photographers. And so Domon says, Kawada's pretty good for a young photographer. He has a good eye. But the image he sent in, they were too disparate, too mixed up. Not enough of a center. So he said, because he's the editor, right? He can do this. He said, I chose the five images that focused on children, because that gives it more of a focus and a core, right? And it's more effective in terms of, an emotional reaction. It's more like photorealism, right? So it shows, I think, the role that Domon played in not just the selection of images, but the sort of crafting of what narratives get told in photography. And then also makes the careers of these young photographers, including Kawada. Because after this, Kawada goes on to basically serve as Domon's assistant. And then after serving as Domon's assistant, they go to Hiroshima together in the late 50s. And that's where Kawada begins his project of photographing for what will become the photobook, the Mac, which appears in a variety of different magazines. Is that going to be okay? Yes. Okay. Appears in a variety of different magazines, mostly photo art, also Nippon Camera a little bit,
yes,
but mostly photo art.
I'll just add, the map wasn't yet the overall name for the project. It was just the name of one set of images published in Photo Art. Other titles of these sets of images were called The Man and Stronghold, for example. Full body of work hadn't coalesced yet. That would take a few more years. Also, Kawada was releasing images in different magazines in different formats around the same time. While they were loosely related, they didn't yet form a single cohesive body of work. This demonstrates how Kawada used the magazine as a space for experimentation.
Yeah, I love in the book, in Ivan's book, he uses the word laboratory or laboratory, that these magazines often could be these sort of experimental venues where photographers could try out different relationships between images, different exposures, different printings. And for Kawada especially, this is particularly true for the sort of creation of the map. He starts shooting it in 58, 59, and the book itself doesn't get published until 1965. So this is a very long durée sort of project that takes several different subject matters as its core. And so here you can see him playing around with, I should have mentioned before, the previous ones were mostly what we call the stains. So these are images of surfaces in Hiroshima, particularly the A-bomb dome, which is the main structure that's a sort of memorial site there. And then this is another category of old military forts, primarily in and around Tokyo. And then this one is this very unusual, a little bit amorphous category. It's not well defined here in the magazine. It's the man, which is not how he refers to it later. As he refers to it later in the photo book, it's kinenbutsu, which is memorial goods. But it's a lot of images of, how would you refer to it? Like objects, memorial objects, primarily in either military history museums or in the Hiroshima Memorial Museum in particular.
Just as trivia, this is the map, and then on the following page is a series by Fukase Masahisa. So within the same issue, you have amazing legends.
Yeah. So, and all I'll say about Kawada before we sort of move on is, I think this is really evident of using the magazine as a way to think about not just which images to choose for a final photo book publication, because you mentioned in the book also that in some ways the magazine could operate as a kind of like, okay, like what's the value of pushing these photographs into another publication format? Is there a market for this, essentially, right? It was sort of a test case. And for Kawada, I think it's not just, are these images marketable or what images should I choose? But indeed, like, what is the physical relationship between these images page by page? Because when the final photo book actually gets published, as it goes through multiple iterations, it ends up in a format in which everything is double gatefolded and printed on both sides in full bleed photogravure. So he's really thinking about this sort of page by page relationship and using, I think, the magazine as a way to experiment with that.
I will point out that the New York Public Library is the only place in the world that you will have the original maquette version that Claude himself made. And they also have the first edition of the map itself.
Yes. Well, we have all the facsimiles, but that's not as special. Yeah.
So the maquette is the only one, and even Kawada doesn't own it. And if you ask nicely, you will be able to see it in person. And what makes maquette of particular significance is that it was printed on a special paper that was called HC, which very, very thin photographs, a photosensitive paper that's so thin that it can be folded. There were many instances of photographers using actual prints to make books that were glued and bound together. And the maquette that the New York Public Library owns is one example of that.
In thinking about the way in which this sort of first generation of post-war photographers, thinking about people like Kawada, but also Tomatsu Shomei, Narahara Hikono, Hosue Eiko, they have a particular relationship to the magazine, I think. It's a sort of a stepping stone. It's a necessary place in which their work sort of has to be published. And it has to be, I think, especially early on, it has to be sort of like deemed okay by the powers that be, like Domon and like Kimura Ihei to a certain extent, right? That there's a sort of editorial class that's helping them move into their careers as photographers. Because as Ivan mentioned, the exhibition, while it exists as a possibility, it's not as nearly as important or as prevalent in the 50s and 60s in the photography world. It really is the kind of magazine space and the photo book space that helps people establish themselves as artists. How do you see that sort of changing, if at all, like the photographer's relationship to the magazine, if at all, as we move sort of into the next generation of photographers, which many of you may already know, sort of Provoke era, so Moriyama, Daido, and it's Nagagita Takama. Yeah.
Well, okay, that's a big touch. But it's good to begin with using Moriyama Daido as an example of that transition period. So at this time, there were examples of exhibitions that were being made by photographers, and that did sync up with publications, publication in magazines. It was always a one-to-one relationship. Making prints for exhibition was possible, and in many cases, they were done in the spaces that were created by camera manufacturers, like they call them Skimrock. These were places where photographers could also show work. But it wasn't until the late 70s or late 80s when the idea of prints in a space as an exhibition really came to be something that was consciously thought through as part of photographic expression. And even at that time, in the late 70s and early 80s, there was not a lot of satisfaction with what an exhibition space could do because its reach just could not be matched by what was done in magazine. So looking here at Moriyama Daido, who is an emblem of magazines at this time, what we were saying before, under the like the code editors being promoted and drawn up, Moriyama is one of these young photographers who was getting pages in magazines. And in Moriyama's case, it was Hiroshi Hamaya, who was the legendary editor at Kaneko for many, many years. He gave such amount of pages to young photographers. Here, Moriyama is looking at the Japanese theater. This is Nippon Gekido, a Japanese theater in Japan, was published. And that book, his first photo book, brings together his various magazine work. For Moriyama to be photographing theater is looking back into Japanese traditions that are pretty modern, but it also is straddling this underground culture and avant-garde culture. And this is really a context in which Moriyama will just do a few more pages of Goliga. And this is one of the first times that Moriyama's work was shown in color, even though in the book it's all black and white.
And for someone like Moriyama and the sort of Provoke crew, that sense of kind of immediacy and propulsive, unending streams of images and data and media, especially visual data and media, like that feels very important to me, because I feel like if people sort of, I mean, I know a lot of people think, or if you know about Provoke, you sort of associate it with this like arebure bokeh, which is this rough, blurry, out of focus sense of a kind of a grain or a texture of the image. But I think equally as important is this sort of obsessiveness with media in and of itself. And the magazine feels to me very crucial to that.
Right. Yeah. When I was showing you the Leslie Krim's group discussion, so that is what happens every month on an ongoing basis. As Maggie is saying, the discourse around how we look at photographs and how we think about photographs is iterative. You get them on an updated month-to-month basis in an ongoing way. And that forum, that process of developing a language for photography is continually happening.
What we were saying, how much earlier, if it's not in print, it didn't happen.
Right.
Much like with Instagram.
It's like pics or it didn't happen, but essentially it's like if it's not in a photo magazine, if it's not in one of these magazines, it doesn't count. All of it was happening here. Even the sort of discussions about, I mean, this is going back a little bit, honestly, not moving forward chronologically, but even thinking about the way in which some of these major debates between photographers and critics about like what is the role of photography in relationship to violence, social justice. Like if we're not going to do realist photography anymore, what are we going to do? What does Japan as a nation's relationship to image making look like? Right? Sort of theoretical, but very deeply important conversations. These are happening in all of these pages. And in fact, a lot of it is an actual dialogue. So month to month, you get photographers sort of responding to one another.
Yeah, it's important to point out that exactly it's a dialogue. This is constant butting up heads, exchanging ideas, and that's happening in real time in these magazines.
That is directly influencing photography that is being made thereafter. So you can't consider post-war period photography without seeing the evolution of discourse in these magazine pages. And Fukase, which we're going to look at next, is a golden example of being a magazine baby.
Yeah, he is a magazine baby. Yeah. And I think, just to also mention Moriyama, I think goes on not just to publish Provoke, which technically is a magazine, although it's very different, but then it still publishes his own magazine to this day, right?
Yes, and that underscores the importance of magazine publishing to photographers in this period, as we were saying before. So let's jump ahead to Man by Ishiuchi and Narahashi.
A good way to convince you of how important magazines are to the history of Japanese photography is that after a lot of magazines start to lose their power in terms of their influence and their credibility amongst their readership, photographers themselves started making their own magazines. So they were creating their own media and distributing it themselves. And there are so many examples, especially from the late 70s to the early 80s, photographers not just making their own magazines, but also organizing their own gallery spaces. Not a gallery in the sense that we understand it with gallerists and making exhibitions for sale. These gallery spaces were made for themselves to exchange ideas. And many of these spaces had their own magazines that were also published as well. There's a specific word for it, dojinshi, which linked the Jishu Gallery. Dojinshi came from the word of literature and literary publications, and that's a quarter. Like,
as we mentioned before, photographers started to make their own magazines by pooling together resources with other photographers. These were called dojinshi. One example of this is Man by Ishiuchi Miyako and Narahashi Asako. They produced and distributed this magazine themselves. And yes, I asked, they lost money.
but they kept making that, and they committed 10, and they published 10 magazines. And it is their photography, and in later issues, they do interviews with photographers and features. So they're literally making their own magazine.
Just the sheer volume alone of these independently produced publications is an indication of how important magazines were to the Japanese photography community. Get your workout on your own terms.
Do you think that's also a function of gender too? I mean, I know that it wasn't like male photographers also made dojinshi too, but I think one thing that we should recognize is that, women are everywhere in these magazines, but they're in the images, right? They're not fundamental. Like, this is a male dominated image making business in the magazine. And that's because, for the most part, the story that we tell in Japanese photography is still very male dominated. And women did have their photography in these magazines, but it was not nearly as frequent. Do you think Ishiuchi also, in some ways, went this particular route with Man because it was, in some ways, almost easier?
There's definitely an element of that. And as you've pointed out, it wasn't easy being a woman in this machismo climate. And certainly, Man, I think, came together because Ishiuchi wanted to work with another woman.
Ishiuchi reached out to the younger Narahashi and said, let's do this magazine together. Narahashi was like, what? You? Why me? There was another magazine that was published out of, was it Kobe or Osaka?
The title was Shaba Shaba, and the publisher was Aya Tomoka.
But she organized a magazine out of 6 women photographers, and I think they did 3 issues.
Yeah.
I'll also mention the exhibition that Ishiuchi organized called Hyakka Ryoran. I discussed it in a magazine book. It was an exhibition of 10 female photographers, and the theme was man. So, to your point, which you made a moment ago, Ishiuchi explained that she wanted to turn the tables and flip the power dynamic between the typical male photographer and what was typically the female subject. And like all indie exhibitions at that time, it was just open for a few days, but it was attended by all the movers and shakers of the photography community. On top of that, she got coverage in a weekly magazine. She also got television coverage. It was a total coup.
Can you talk a little bit about what the bonsai means? I know you mentioned it earlier with the other Ryuichi, but as we get into Fukase, I think it's important.
The photographer will have a certain number of pages. This one is written. I have this at number 5. And the more of these serials, it's also on prestige. The most famous one being, well, the one that the most ever seen was Tomato Shogun. And I think that one we have been simultaneously produced red stack in magazines, in different magazines. Yeah. And that was
And photographers were compensated for their contribution. So having a regular outlet to get your work out into the world on a consistent basis is quite remarkable.
And I mentioned, I guess, sort of earlier, Kawada in relationship to the map, sort of using it as a bit of a laboratory. I mean, this is Fukase in the late 70s, moving into the 1980s, essentially working through what would become the photo book Ravens. And it feels so different to me, the Rensai approach, or this sort of having this format to work through these images feels so distinct to me, at least, from the kind of work that Kawada is getting done in magazines. This feels like a series of distinct projects that are related to the photo book, but have their own life and have their own narrative, their own aesthetic in some way. I mean, in some cases, he's doing incredibly psychedelic color work with double exposures and lots of experimental, which if you know Ravens the photo book, could not be farther from what Ravens the photo book looks like, which is this feels so different. And yet it also feels deeply integral to the project. Like to me, I feel like I can't separate them necessarily from the photo book. This is again, a kind of longue durée relationship to making these kinds of images that moves from sort of travel log to surreal poetry to these sort of very kind of austere, monochromatic work that is focused on this sort of symbol of the raven. Okay?
This is Fukase. So each of the features that are in the magazine, everyone gets their bio and they explain what the photography is. So you're not just showing the images, you're also expected to explain what is it that you are showing. But yes, while you show right here.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah. Or this is the second, and before you show the magazine, this is issue number, this is the number 2 in the series. And in this case, there's a very long memoir about him taking the train from Tokyo to Hokkaido, where his family is, and then what happens when he sees his father, his brother, and also the very sad, anguished feeling that he has that this may be the end of his marriage. This long text is only in the first one, but the last one also has a very long text where he summarizes the entire project. And all of this is missing. It's not, he chose not to include it in the book.
This feels in some ways like a kind of a classic moment of translation from the magazine format to the photo book. We certainly have examples of Japanese photo books where there is text included, poetic or otherwise, but this sort of culmination or a kind of different version of the project in which the images are sort of driving the relationship and the narrative. That's one thing that I think the magazine does really allow for, especially in a project like Realism, that is sort of unfolding over time as Fukase is grappling with his own addictions, plural, his relationship to his family, his failing relationship to his wife, Yoko, which becomes the sort of generative tragedy of this series. To be able to sort of create text narratives alongside that, whether they are sort of more poetic or more kind of autobiographical, does allow you to sort of like read the story differently. And it's the same with, I think, Kawada to a certain extent, although he has very little text over the new magazine publication. Not nearly the same.
Sure.
So in the time we have left before we answer the audience any questions, there's a reason that you stopped the timeline in the 1980s of the book. What happens to the magazine industry? What happens to sort of like the field, the sort of art form's relationship to the magazine? Why is 1980 this sort of endpoint for you about in telling this part of the story?
Sure.
Magazines were inextricably linked to the camera manufacturing industry. So when in the 80s, the manufacturing industry went through a period of contraction that directly affected the livelihood of magazines. There was less advertising dollars, and simply put, there was a market saturation with camera gear and camera equipment. Also, there was competition from other technologies like the camcorder and the VCR.
then you start having magazines starting to shut down. The big magazines did stay around for a while. The most significant one that stopped was Temper Manichi in 1985. And that is kind of a symbolic end to the golden era of photography magazines.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ivan. I'm so pleased and honored that you were able to come here and share this conversation and all of these incredible magazines with us.